The railway line moved through a quiet section of countryside where human presence was limited and intermittent. The track followed a long, gradual curve, bordered by low vegetation and scattered trees. In some places, the land opened into wide, empty fields. In others, it narrowed into shallow embankments, with the rails slightly elevated above the surrounding ground. There were no nearby towns within immediate walking distance. No stations interrupted this stretch. The infrastructure was minimal signal posts, gravel beds, and the steel rails themselves, laid across wooden sleepers that had endured years of weather and vibration. Maintenance crews passed through occasionally, but most of the time, the line remained undisturbed. On that day, conditions were stable. The sky was clear, and visibility was high. There were no immediate signs of environmental stress, no flooding, no visible obstruction, no indication that the track ahead would behave differently than it had for countless trains before. Trains moved through this section routinely, often without slowing. Passengers rarely noticed the landscape. It was transitional space, something between departure and arrival, a place defined more by movement than by presence. But isolation, in such locations, carries a specific quality. Distance is not only measured in kilometers, but in response time. Access depends on infrastructure that is not always immediate. Communication relies on systems that can fail or become delayed. In places like this, when something changes, it does not resolve quickly. The track continues forward, uninterrupted, until it doesn't. The train was part of a scheduled passenger service, operating along a regional route that connected multiple cities across a wide geographic area. It followed a fixed timetable, with designated stops at stations spaced at regular intervals. Between these stops were long stretches of uninterrupted track, where trains maintained consistent speed to preserve timing across the network. The composition of the train reflected standard intercity design. Multiple passenger coaches were arranged in sequence behind a locomotive or integrated power unit, depending on the system in use. Each carriage was structured for capacity and efficiency, with rows of seats aligned along central aisles. Some compartments were reserved, while others allowed general seating. Overhead storage held luggage of varying sizes, and entry points were positioned at both ends of each coach. On board were individuals with unrelated destinations and purposes. Some were traveling for work, carrying documents or electronic devices focused on tasks that continued during transit. Others were returning home, their belongings packed in bags, stored above or beside them. There were also passengers making short-distance journeys between smaller towns, using the train as a routine mode of transport. Rail travel in such regions is often defined by predictability. The system relies on coordination between signaling, infrastructure, track maintenance, and operational oversight. For passengers, this predictability reduces the need for attention. Once seated, most individuals disengage from the mechanics of the journey. Crew members were assigned specific responsibilities. Conductors monitored ticketing and passenger movement, moving between coaches at intervals. The operator maintained control of speed and adherence to signals, guided by both automated systems and manual oversight. Communication between crew and control centers was maintained through established channels, allowing for updates or instructions if required. There was no indication, at departure or during the early portion of the journey, that conditions deviated from normal operation. The train progressed according to schedule, passing through stations without delay. Systems on board functioned as expected. Passengers remained largely unaware of the track conditions ahead, as is typical in rail travel. The route itself had been used consistently over time. Inspections and maintenance routines were part of standard railway operations, though the exact timing and condition of each segment could vary. In most cases, these systems prevent failure before it occurs. When issues arise, they are often detected early enough to avoid consequence. But not all failures present themselves in advance. As the train approached the remote section of track described earlier, its speed remained steady. There were no immediate signals requiring deceleration, no visible hazards. The transition from monitored space to isolation happened without notice. Inside the carriages, movement continued in ordinary ways. Some passengers were seated quietly, Others adjusted their position or prepared for upcoming stops. The environment was controlled, enclosed, and stable. The connection between the train and the track beneath it remained assumed, not examined. That assumption would not hold. The transition from stability to failure occurred without warning. As the train moved through the curved section of track, a disruption formed at the point where wheel and rail were expected to maintain continuous alignment. The exact cause, whether mechanical fault, track deformation, or structural weakness, was not immediately visible to those on board. What followed was a rapid sequence of physical displacements. The first indication was a change in motion. A lateral shift, subtle at first, then increasing. The carriage bodies began to move out of alignment with the rails beneath them. This was followed by a series of impacts as the wheel assemblies lost their guided path. The sound was abrupt metal under strain, followed by repeated contact between carriage structures and the track infrastructure. Within seconds, the train's forward motion was interrupted. Some carriages remained partially upright, while others tilted at varying angles. At least one left the track entirely, coming to rest against the uneven ground beside the railbed. The coupling between coaches absorbed part of the force, but not enough to maintain uniform positioning. Inside the train, unsecured items shifted immediately. Luggage fell from overhead compartments. Passengers were displaced from their seats or forced against fixed surfaces. The internal environment, previously controlled, became unstable. Lighting systems flickered or failed in certain sections. The sound of movement gave way to a sudden stillness, interrupted only by residual mechanical noise. The duration of the event was brief, measured in seconds. Its effects were not. When the motion stopped, the train no longer occupied its intended orientation. Some carriages leaned at angles that altered the interior layout. Floors became uneven. Passageways were obstructed by debris or structural deformation. Doors that once opened easily were now misaligned or jammed. There was no immediate external response. The surrounding area remained unchanged, no nearby structures, no visible personnel, no rapid intervention. The isolation described earlier became immediate and functional. Passengers and crew remained within the altered structure, without a clear understanding of the extent of damage beyond their immediate surroundings. Communication systems were not uniformly accessible. Visual confirmation of the full situation required movement through compromised spaces. The train had stopped, but the event had not resolved. The condition that followed was not movement, but interruption. In the minutes following the derailment, there was no coordinated response. Movement inside the carriages resumed gradually, not as routine activity, but as a necessary adjustment to altered conditions. Passengers began to orient themselves within spaces that no longer matched their original layout. Seats were no longer level. Aisles were partially blocked. Some individuals remained where they had come to rest, while others attempted to stand, using seatbacks or window frames for support. The shift from passive travel to active awareness occurred without instruction. Crew members initiated the first structured actions. Their role shifted immediately from service to assessment. They moved through accessible sections of the train, checking for injuries and identifying areas where passage was still possible. In some cases, movement between carriages was obstructed due to misalignment at the coupling points. This limited the ability to gain a complete overview. The condition of each carriage varied. Some remained largely intact, with only minor internal disruption. Others showed clear structural strain, walls bent slightly, doors offset from their frames, windows cracked but not fully broken. In at least one section, a carriage had shifted enough that entry or exit required navigating through a tilted doorway or window opening. Initial injury assessment was inconsistent. Those with visible injuries were identified first: bleeding, immobility, or signs of disorientation. Others remained unaccounted for, either out of view or unable to respond. Without centralized coordination, information was fragmented. Each group of passengers had only partial awareness of the situation. Communication systems were limited. Personal mobile devices were present, but signal strength in the area was uncertain. Some attempts to make contact were made, though it was not immediately clear whether messages were transmitted successfully. The train's internal communication systems, if functional, were not accessible to all. Outside the train, the environment remained unchanged. The same open land, the same absence of nearby structures, no visible responders appeared within the initial period. The track, now partially obstructed by displaced carriages, no longer served its function as a route of movement. Passengers who were able began assisting others. This assistance was not organized, but it followed a pattern helping individuals stand, clearing small obstructions, retrieving items that had fallen. In some cases, clothing or personal belongings were used to stabilize or support those with injuries. Time began to take on a different structure. Without a clear sense of external response, attention shifted to immediate conditions. Who was injured? Who could move? What parts of the train were accessible? The event itself had ended, but its consequences were still being understood. The train, once a system in motion, had become a static environment requiring evaluation. After the initial assessment, survivors began forming basic patterns of organization. This was not formal leadership, but practical coordination arising from necessity. Individuals with prior experience in first aid, construction, or general problem solving often assumed informal roles, directing movement through the tilted carriages and identifying hazards. The first priority was safety. Passengers were guided to sections of the train that remained structurally stable. Areas where floors were slanted, walls were compromised, or ceilings had shifted were marked, verbally or by physical barriers, to prevent accidental injury. In the absence of tools, luggage, clothing, or other objects were used to indicate danger zones. Next was accounting for all passengers. Names were not recorded systematically, but groups communicated verbally. Those who could move assisted those who were injured or disoriented. Minor injuries, cuts, bruises, sprains were treated using available materials. Clothing was used to apply pressure or make splints. Limited first aid kits on board were distributed. Serious injuries were identified and prioritized for attention. Access to necessities became an early concern. Water bottles, snacks, and any other consumables stored in luggage or onboard compartments were gathered. These resources were divided among survivors in a manner that emphasized equitable distribution. Decisions were pragmatic, based on immediate needs rather than preference. Movement within the train continued cautiously. Passage through jammed doors or tilted sections required physical support. Small groups formed to navigate these areas, ensuring no individual was left isolated. The most mobile passengers often served as intermediaries, carrying supplies or assisting others through restricted sections. Communication remained limited. Attempts to reach external assistance were intermittent, dependent on device functionality and signal strength. In the absence of contact, survivors relied on observation, listening for distant sounds, watching for changes in the environment, and maintaining visual checks on nearby passengers. Mental clarity was also addressed, though implicitly. Survivors encouraged one another to remain calm, maintain focus on tangible tasks, and avoid panicked movement. The monotony of waiting was interrupted by these practical routines, which provided structure and purpose. By the end of the first hour, an emergent order existed. Spaces were mapped, injuries were identified, and resources were distributed. Though temporary, these measures reduced immediate risk and laid the groundwork for continued survival. The train, once a vehicle of transit, had become a confined environment of self-maintenance. Every movement, every decision, was dictated by the altered reality of the derailment and the isolation it produced. As time passed, the absence of external communication became increasingly apparent. Attempts to use mobile phones produced inconsistent results. Some devices displayed weak signal, others none at all. Radio or intercom systems were either damaged or inaccessible in certain carriages. Survivors were forced to confront the reality that no immediate assistance would arrive on schedule. The environment outside remained unchanged. Fields and sparse vegetation stretched in all directions. There were no visible roads or structures, and no signs of personnel approaching. The train, immobilized and partially derailed, was both isolated and conspicuous, yet still beyond the reach of routine observation or intervention. Within the train, a new rhythm emerged. Survivors divided attention between monitoring each other and performing practical tasks. Injured individuals were regularly checked. Supplies were conserved carefully, with water and food rationed according to availability. Passengers retrieved what they could from luggage and compartments, keeping essentials close at hand. Physical activity became limited to necessity. Walking through tilted corridors required careful balance. Climbing over obstructions demanded energy that could not be wasted. Most survivors remained seated or stationary when possible, preserving strength for potential tasks or emergencies. Rest was intermittent, punctuated by the need to assist others or respond to environmental changes, such as fluctuating temperature inside the carriages or shifts in the train's position on uneven ground. Mental endurance was equally important. With no indication of when help might arrive, survivors relied on observation and practical routines to maintain focus. Conversations revolved around status checks, resource management, and navigation of the immediate environment. Speculation about external conditions was present but measured, constrained by the recognition that accurate information was unavailable. Noise and light provided cues. The wind outside, distant animal calls, or the sound of structural settling became part of the environment. Flickering lights or sections of darkness dictated movement. Survivors adapted, timing activities to available visibility and coordinating movement to minimize risk. Time became abstract. Minutes, hours, and later, the progression from morning to afternoon were noted primarily by changes in natural light or the train's internal conditions. The absence of external reference points amplified the sense of isolation. Even minor developments, shifts in passenger location, small adjustments in supplies, or changes in weather were significant markers. The train had ceased to function as a vehicle. It had become a contained environment in which survival required careful observation, disciplined routine, and continuous assessment. Each hour passed without confirmation of rescue reinforced the necessity of self-reliance. As the hours stretched on, the physical condition of the survivors became an increasing concern. Minor injuries, scrapes, bruises, and sprains needed ongoing attention to prevent infection or further harm. More serious injuries were stabilized using improvised supports. Clothing, luggage, and other materials were repurposed as bandages or splints. Limited first aid supplies were monitored closely, with use rationed to critical cases. Temperature management was a practical challenge. Even in temperate weather, the open structure of the derailed train allowed wind and drafts to penetrate carriages. Survivors adjusted by layering clothing, huddling where possible, and using available materials for insulation. Windows that could be closed were sealed. Gaps were blocked with luggage or blankets. Where possible, movement was used to maintain warmth without expending unnecessary energy. Hydration and nutrition were rationed carefully. Bottled water and any perishable food items were shared according to immediate need. Consumption was measured, with attention to the expected duration of isolation. Some passengers had packed snacks. Others improvised by consuming small amounts in stages. The priority was to sustain essential bodily functions rather than comfort. Time was divided by routine. Checks on the injured were scheduled, and movement through carriages occurred in deliberate sequences. Survivors established small patterns, walking once every hour, redistributing supplies, assessing structural stability. These actions provided structure in an otherwise static environment and helped maintain mental clarity. Repetition became a tool for endurance, a way to mark the passage of time and avoid disorientation. Noise and environmental cues were monitored. Settling wood, shifting metal, and external wind were noted as indicators of safety or risk. Survivors communicated these observations to one another. The sound of distant vehicles or trains was carefully listened for, though none were detected during the initial hours of isolation. Psychological strain was present, but understated. Survivors remained focused on tasks, using activity to mitigate anxiety. They maintained a calm demeanor, avoiding unnecessary speculation about rescue or the conditions beyond their observation. Conversation centered on facts where movement was possible, the status of injuries, and the allocation of resources. In this manner, survivors continued to adapt. The immediate challenge was not only physical survival, but also the disciplined management of limited resources and time. Each small action, tending an injury, sealing a gap, sharing water, was an incremental step in sustaining life while waiting. The train, motionless and altered by the derailment, became a microcosm of endurance. The landscape outside remained distant and indifferent. Inside, every measure of control mattered. As hours turned into multiple cycles of light and shadow, the strain on survivors increased. Fatigue compounded minor injuries. Muscles stiffened from prolonged immobility, and small abrasions began to ache or swell. The limited mobility inside the tilted carriages meant that movement, even for essential tasks, carried a risk of aggravating injuries. Food and water reserves, while initially adequate, began to diminish. Survivors adjusted consumption further, prioritizing those most in need, but the scarcity added an additional layer of concern. Simple acts, such as standing to reach a bottle of water or shifting to a more stable position, became deliberate decisions, weighed against potential exertion and energy expenditure. The psychological pressure intensified. Isolation became tangible, measured by the unchanging landscape beyond the windows and the absence of external signals. Communication with the outside world remained impossible. Even sporadic attempts to send messages or make calls produced silence. With no confirmation of rescue, the temporal markers that structured daily life, hours, meal times, and external cues lost reliability. Uncertainty extended to structural safety. The carriages, already compromised, occasionally shifted slightly under residual mechanical stress or environmental influence. Each unexpected movement elicited careful observation, assessment, and minor adjustments to the internal environment. Passengers maintained vigilance, recognizing that further structural failure could worsen injuries or obstruct movement entirely. Within the confined space, survivors became hyper-aware of one another. Individual health changes were immediately noted. Paleness, shivering, or slowed movement signaled a need for attention. Groups continued to assist, but the cumulative effect of exhaustion and prolonged stress made coordination more difficult. Time became abstract. Light changed, shadows lengthened, and the external environment remained distant. There was no guarantee that rescue would arrive, no timeline for intervention, and no certainty that current measures would be sufficient. The train, once a vehicle of transit and efficiency, had become a space defined by waiting, monitoring, and endurance. Each passing hour was measured not only in minutes, but in the persistence of control over injury, resources, and environmental exposure. As isolation persisted, survivors explored every feasible method to establish contact with the outside world. Some ventured cautiously to windows and doors, testing the surrounding terrain. The embankment beside the tracks offered limited visibility, but the distance to any nearby road or inhabited area was greater than could be crossed safely with injuries and uneven footing. Mobile devices were checked repeatedly. Signal strength remained inconsistent, with some attempts failing entirely. Where calls connected briefly, they could not reliably reach emergency services. Text messages or short updates were sent when possible, though confirmation of receipt was never verified. Survivors adjusted strategies to conserve battery life, recognizing the potential for prolonged waiting. Crew members, to the extent they were able, documented the train's condition and the location of passengers. These notes were retained for potential communication or rescue, but immediate utility was limited. Efforts to attract attention, such as signaling through windows or creating visible markers, were attempted, though the surrounding area provided minimal vantage points for passing vehicles or observers. The physical and psychological strain of these attempts became apparent. Those carrying out outreach activities expended energy that was already limited. Repeated failures to establish contact reinforced the reality of isolation, yet survivors continued systematically. Every action was measured, practical, and deliberate. No unnecessary risks were taken. Movement focused on either preserving life, maintaining health, or increasing the likelihood of external detection. Despite these efforts, hours continued without response. The train remained isolated, its position both conspicuous and unreachable under prevailing conditions. Survivors returned to routines, checking injuries, conserving resources, and monitoring each other while maintaining readiness to act if an opportunity to communicate arose. The situation remained unresolved. Rescue, though hoped for, was not immediate. The train had become a static, self-contained environment, dependent entirely on the discipline and endurance of those within it. After hours of isolation, external personnel finally reached the site. The rescue team approached cautiously, guided by partial reports and visible signs of the derailment. They moved along the embankment, assessing access points and ensuring structural stability before entering the carriages. Survivors, fatigued and tense, remained in their assigned spaces. Crew members assisted responders in navigating the tilted and obstructed carriages. Injured individuals were carefully transferred to waiting medical personnel. Minor injuries were documented, and more serious conditions were prioritized for immediate attention. The surrounding environment remained quiet, indifferent to the presence of emergency teams. No dramatic intervention occurred. The work was methodical and controlled. Rescue focused on extraction and stabilization, not dramatization. Equipment was deployed only as required: stretchered movement, careful lifting of passengers, and verification of structural integrity. Communication with the wider network resumed gradually. Passengers provided basic details, while responders coordinated further medical evaluation. The situation that had persisted for hours shifted from containment and self-management to structured extraction. Within a controlled time frame, all accessible survivors were removed from the derailed train. The incident concluded without ceremony or spectacle. The environment outside remained as it had been: fields, sparse vegetation, and open sky. The train, once in motion, now stood as a static testament to both mechanical failure and human endurance. In the days following the derailment, investigators documented the incident. The cause was analyzed through track inspection, mechanical evaluation, and operational records. Reports focused on physical failures, procedural responses, and the timeline of survival. No lives were lost, though injuries ranged from minor to moderate. Passengers returned to their routines with minimal public attention. Crew members provided statements, and the train service resumed once the track was repaired. The incident is recorded as an example of survival in isolation, not through dramatic heroism, but through methodical assessment, disciplined cooperation, and practical endurance. The derailed train remains a quiet reminder of the vulnerability inherent in routine systems and the structured resilience of those who endure interruption.